Next, we have Maryam Shanechi. I just learned we might have overlapped together at MIT at some point in time in the past. She's a professor at USC, and she's going to be talking about neural and behavioral connections and how to model them.
Is this working, or?
Yeah.
So I can walk a little bit?
Yeah, you can.
All right. All right, great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab on developing dynamical models of neural behavioral data and also applying those to developing new generation of neurotechnologies. So as we are all very familiar with this framework, one way to model the dynamics of neural activity is through this latent state dynamical system representation, where we describe neural data in terms of these low-dimensional latent states and also describe how these latent states evolve over time. For example, I'm showing you the simplest instantiation of this dynamical system model, which is a linear dynamical system or state space model. And it's been quite powerful in the field. For example, we've been using these and building multiple capabilities to extend them for various applications. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we've basically been building additional capabilities on top of these by adding behavior, by adding input into the model, by making these nonlinear, and eventually by making these multi-scale to take into account multiple modalities of neural activity. And we do this both to, of course, study neural computation, but also beyond that, we're interested in developing brain-computer interfaces and closed-loop neuromodulation system that can restore lost motor and emotional function. All right, so this is our basic linear dynamical system model. And it has quite a bit of power. For example, back a few years back, we actually utilized these latent state models and developed new spatial and temporal dimensionality reduction methods for human intracranial EEG activity and showed that by doing this, we can, for the first time, decode mood variations in every individual, thus opening the door to personalized tracking of mental states. And these models have been quite ubiquitous, I would say, for brain-computer interface development. And one reason for that is their ability for flexible inference, meaning the same model can allow you to perform real-time decoding or inference, what we call also filtering, non-causal decoding and inference, what we call smoothing, and inference even with missing neural samples, which happen quite a bit, for example, in wireless BCIs. So this is great. But unfortunately, these models don't capture nonlinearity. Now, there's been a lot of beautiful work, of course, in this community on developing deep learning models of neural activity. But these largely focus on offline analysis and do not enable flexible inference. So in a recent work a couple of years ago, our goal was to try to achieve the best of both worlds. Can we develop deep learning architecture that allow you to capture nonlinearity as well as flexible inference? And we developed this architecture we call DEFINE for dynamical flexible inference of nonlinear embeddings that can do that. So the intuition behind DEFINE is simple. The idea here is, can we capture the nonlinearity within a manifold embedding, basically in the shape over which neural activity evolves? And if we can do so, is it good enough to approximate how neural activity moves on the manifold, for example, on this torus, using a linear dynamical system model? And if we can train these manifold and dynamics jointly, perhaps we can get a good representation, and because of that linearity, we can enable flexible inference. So that was the intuition. For those technically inclined, this is the generative model. So basically, we have a set of manifold latent factors that give rise to neural activity. We describe that relationship with a nonlinear feed-forward neural network. And then on top of this manifold, we write down a linear dynamical system model. We train them jointly to describe or forecast future neural activity and learn those dynamics well. And then we can actually utilize a simple Kalman filter on the manifold once we encode the manifold factors to do flexible inference. So how does this work? We applied this in multiple data sets, including a reach and grasp movement data set in which monkeys were reaching and grasping to 3D space while neural activity was being recorded. And we first confirmed that define could indeed enable flexible inference, real-time, non-causal, with missing samples. Then we compared to a bunch of benchmark, including the linear model. So first, you can see, of course, nonlinearity helps. We do better than linear models. And then we compared with the benchmark sequential autoencoder model, also called LFAT. And we found that we also could outperform that, and especially when there were more missing samples. And this showed the robustness of architectures to missing neural samples, which is important for BCIs. All right, so this is great, but what I've talked about so far is unsupervised learning of these dynamical system models for neural data. I mean, unsupervised with respect to behavior. But of course, in a lot of applications and also studies, we care about this relationship between the two. So in the past few years, my lab has been focused on developing these joint latent state dynamical modeling framework for neural and behavioral data to essentially try to disentangle behaviorally relevant neural dynamics. So back in 2020, we developed this learning algorithm PSID that can do this. The motivation here is that these latent states that give rise to our neural data may not all be behaviorally relevant, and in particular, a minority of them may be related to the behavior of interest. So if we use an unsupervised learning algorithm, we may actually learn those red states that, while of course exist in neural data, are not directly behaviorally relevant. So what we do in PSID is we develop a dynamical system model. We jointly learn it with neural and behavioral data through these novel kind of subspace projection methods. And then we apply this to, again, these non-human primate data sets and compared with the same exact architecture trained unsupervised. And we see that in terms of decoding movements, PSID did better at every latent state dimension. And more interestingly, it could achieve this better decoding using a much lower dimensional representation, much more efficiently. And the reason for this is, of course, that ability for disentanglement. And this benefit held even when we compare to nonlinear unsupervised methods. We've since extended PSID on the analytical side of things to allow for also outputs that are generalized linear rather than linear. But at the end of the day, PSID and its extensions build on top of this linear dynamical system backbone. And we know that nonlinearity could be important. So the next step for us was to say, can we actually develop dynamical models of neural behavioral data that capture also nonlinearity? So to do this, we developed a deep learning architecture called a dissociative prioritized analysis of dynamics, or DPAD. And essentially what we do in DPAD is to write this relationship between neural activity and behavior in terms of 4 interpretable mappings: the mapping from neural activity to latent states, the dynamics of those states, and then the mapping back to behavior and to neural activity. Now, to make this nonlinear, we allow each of these mappings to be a feed-forward neural network. We allow for categorical behaviors as well as intermittently observed behaviors by changing the loss functions. And we also allow for a naturalistic data set, so we don't really require a trial structure. So again, intuitively, how does this work? Of course, I don't have time to go into the details. So what DPAD is a multi-section recurrent neural network model that is trained with neural and behavioral data jointly using 4 optimization steps. In the first 4 steps, we learn the first section to just capture the behaviorally relevant neural dynamics. And we do this through a behavior likelihood or prediction loss. And then once we capture those dynamics, we say, OK, how much of the dynamics in neural data is not already described? And then we learn those in the last 2 optimization steps to learn the additional neural dynamics. So we tested this on 4 diverse data sets, all of them more cortical movement-related data sets, some public, some non-public, and looked at 4 neural modalities, so 4 scales of neural activity: spiking activity, raw LFP activity, and LFP power activity. So the first question was, okay, is this nonlinear modeling allowing us to better describe behaviorally relevant neural dynamics? So we compared the decoding of behavior with the linear PSID algorithm, because we know it does quite well in terms of decoding behavior. And we found that, as expected, nonlinearity helped in this, learning this transformation. But more interesting than that, what we could do was to compare the degree of nonlinearity across these different scales. And what we found was that these raw LFB signals actually benefited the most from nonlinearity. And by actually nonlinearly modeling them, we could decode behavior more accurately than we could with these traditional LFB power band features that we typically use in neuroscience to study neural oscillations. So what this implies is that there's some behaviorally relevant information that is lost when we compare these spectral powers. And through this direct modeling of the raw signals, we are recovering that information. And in some cases, doing that did even better than modeling spiking data, which was quite interesting. Now, that's just behavior. What about neural activity? This is, at the end of the day, a neural behavioral model. So we compared the neural self-prediction as well with alternatives such as PSID or RNNs that were unsupervised. And we found that not only did it do better in terms of decoding, but did as well or comparable in terms of neural prediction, thus describing overall the neural and behavioral data sets. And we compared to a few benchmarks, LSTMs or Zebra, which is a contrastive network. And we found that both in our data sets as well as the data sets in which Zebra was trained on, DPAD actually outperformed LSTMs and Zebra. All right, great. So far, I've added behavior to this framework. But what about input? We know that neural populations receive a lot of inputs, whether this is neuromodulation, optogenetic, electrical, whether it's sensory input, whether it's input from an upstream brain region. Can we incorporate input also within this dynamical modeling framework? Initially, we were interested in this problem because we care about building closed-loop neuromodulation systems. So here, the idea would be that you incorporate the effect of input within this latent representation. But in order to get informative data, we had to develop novel neuromodulation patterns that were stochastically changing over time to excite the activity across all of the timescales. And we showed that we can actually fit these models such that we can predict how neural activity changes in response to a time-varying stimulation. But if you notice, what I've described so far was completely agnostic to behavior. So can we add behavior back and include the effect of input within the neural behavioral dynamical models? So here's the problem formulation. Let's go back to what we had. We had a bunch of behaviorally relevant states, a bunch of behaviorally irrelevant states. They gave rise to neural activity and to behavior. So now the question we're trying to answer is how the dynamics of these states are generated. In particular, there are two possible sources, right? There's intrinsic dynamics due to the connectivity between the neural populations, but there's also inputs that are coming in and can drive these states. So if you look at this in the frequency domain, you have the intrinsic dynamics corresponding to the transfer function of this input-output box. You have inputs coming in with some spectrum. They get convolved, and you get the neural spectrum. So in the neural spectrum, you have a peak corresponding to intrinsics. You have a peak corresponding to inputs. The question is, can we tease these apart to better interpret neural computations? So with that motivation, we developed a method based on, again, subspace projections that could dissociate intrinsic behaviorally relevant dynamics, both from input dynamics as well as other intrinsic dynamics. We call this input PSID or IPSID. And we tested this in terms of how well it could actually extract these intrinsic dynamics that I mentioned. And to look at intrinsic dynamics, one way would be to study the eigenvalues of the state transition matrix, because that describes both the oscillations and the decay in terms of the excitation that you apply to your neural systems. So because we cannot take into account input, what was interesting to us was to look at different motor tasks that had different sensory input task instructions and ask whether the task-relevant intrinsic dynamics in the motor cortex differed across animals and tasks. So we took two public data sets. One was a monkey reaching on a grid. One was a monkey controlling a manipulando. And first, we use an unsupervised input-driven dynamical system model to look at intrinsic dynamics in motor cortical areas, the overall intrinsic dynamics. And you can see that these eigenvalues are very different. And this makes sense. These are different monkeys. They're doing different things. Maybe they have different internal or cognitive states. Then we said, OK, let's use IPSID to just focus on the behaviorally relevant portion of intrinsic dynamics. And when we did that, these were remarkably similar across different tasks and across different monkeys, unlike the overall intrinsic dynamics, showing us these preserved behaviorally relevant neural dynamics and computations that we could find that we would have missed otherwise. And we have also extended this to a nonlinear model that can capture nonlinear input-output relationship. This will be presented this month, so I won't go into the details of that. All right, so the last step is to add multimodal neural data. So I've shown you all of this. What if I have two modalities, field potentials, for example, and spiking that are capturing different temporal and spatial scales of activity? Because we know that behavior is actually simultaneously represented across all of these scales. So that's something that we've been working on, again, for a few years now. We've been developing models, dynamical system models, that can simultaneously describe the representation of a latent state, both in field potentials as well as a spiking activity. We've been developing learning algorithms for these models, multimodal inference algorithms that can fuse information. I won't go into any of the details. And this has allowed us to go multi-scales with our dynamical system models. So how can we use this for neuroscience? So in an example paper, we use these multi-scale models to look at the representations of naturalistic movements across different scales, in particular in the small-scale spiking versus large-scale LFB activity. And we looked at, again, the eigenvalues of the state transition matrix that describes, essentially, it's a summary statistic of our dynamics. And we looked at spikes alone, LFB alone, and field LFB in combination. And what we found was that while there, of course, existed dynamics across scales that were distinct, there happened to be one dynamical mode that was very similar across the scales and actually reappeared when we fit the scales simultaneously. And when we looked at this shared dynamics, actually they were dominant in describing behavior. So what this implies is that there is this coordinated action across large-scale brain networks that are quite important for explaining naturalistic movements. And because this is the case, we could actually use our multimodal decoders to improve the decoding of movements significantly by fusing information across scales. So this is where we are. I've added behavior to the dynamical system model. I added input. I made it nonlinear. I added multi-scale activity. But in addition to studying neural computation, as I mentioned, we want to use these to develop neurotechnologies. In particular, we are interested in building brain-computer interfaces that take neural activity, decode from that an underlying state of the brain. This could be a movement. It could be mood, let's say in depression. And then we want to use this decoded state as feedback to adjust the parameters of a therapy, let's say neuromodulation frequency and amplitude, in order to take the brain to a target healthy state. So this could be, for example, a depressed mood that you want to regulate and normalize. So this is a closed-loop control system. How do we use all these models to build this system? So first, to build the decoder, we can use all of those neural behavioral models that I talked about. To build the feedback controller, we're using the input-driven models that I've talked about because they can describe the effect of therapy on neural activity and behavior and dissociate it from everything else that's going on. And we are making all of these neurotechnologies multimodal. We're interested both on multiple scales of neurophysiology, but also in neuroimaging, whether it's optical, magnetic, acoustic. We're also interested in neurophysiological recordings, heart rate variability, skin conductance, or even cortisol level, such that we can fuse information and get the best multimodal readout. We're also interested in multiple modalities of input, for example, electrical, optogenetic, focused ultrasound, or even pharmacological intervention to build these closed-loop neurotechnologies for treatments. And because they're multimodal, we're hoping that they can seamlessly extend across a variety of hardware devices, as well as a variety of brain conditions, whether you're talking about mood disorders, chronic pain, OCD, or movement disorders and paralysis. So our final vision is to develop these multi-scale models and systems that can not only extract and decode mental and behavioral states from human brain networks, but also go beyond that and control and regulate these states towards potentially transformative therapies. So with that, thank you again for inviting me. I want to thank my students and the funding sources and take any questions.
Time for questions? All right, I ask a question myself. So you mentioned like the different, you said like, behavior was represented differently in spike and LFP and so on and so on. You want to integrate these things. But there's also the aspect of like, these are two sides of the same generative process, right? So like, it's not that necessarily everything about behavior is reflected in LFP or spike, but rather actually the combination of them could be more meaningful. Is there something in terms of like, the sort of inductive bias that you put into your model that would like weigh in some special aspects of LFP versus spike to extract the sort of description that you want to have for your system, if you explain it?
Yeah, so actually the model is exactly based on that assumption that you said, that there exists a semantic state, as a meaningful state that gives rise to all these observations. Some are at this scale, some are at the other scale. So when we build the model, it's essentially a state space model, a multi-scale state space model that we train purely data-driven. So we don't inject any kind of assumption because we don't even know how much of the information across scales is shared or distinct. So we essentially fit these models across scales with just data-driven approaches, and then we study that latent representation. So what I showed you was that we found actually some dynamical modes that were distinct and some that were actually shared between spike and LFE. And those shared ones actually happened to be very behaviorally relevant, meaning there was a recruitment of large-scale brain networks that were actually deriving behavior, and that was the element that was shared across the spike and LFE modalities. But this is fully data-driven based on the assumption that there exists these latent states that give rise to both, and there exist common and uncommon parts to those states.
Okay. Further questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. So I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts about connecting this latent dynamical system with cell types and more the kind of microcircuit biology and go back and forth? For example, it's known that perturbations, proximity perturbations, is important to know the dynamics of inhibitory neurons. So how you connect with perturbation experiments and data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think if we do know the different cell types, right, and we can actually tag them and label them, for example, we can group them differently and again associate with them some shared and distinct latent representations, right, to understand the kind of the relationship and interactions between them. So basically, essentially treat them as two groups. That's one thing. The other thing is if you know that, for example, your perturbation has a distinct effect on different cell types, you could actually perhaps put that constraint as you're fitting your dynamical system model into your fitting. So basically solve a constraint optimization as you're fitting it. But some of this knowledge should come from the biophysics to inform how you formulate the dynamical system model, and some of it you can do it in a data-driven manner.
Any last question? Eric.
Somewhere, like some data set with some behavior, extract some.
Very easy. You just go to our GitHub and download the code. Yeah.
Everybody should do it then. Okay.
Yeah. There you go.
Eric, last question.
Okay, may I ask, please, again about this jointly shared mode across the scales? That seemed extremely interesting. Are there any other ways that that could have also been discovered? For example, in your earlier work where you had the joint modeling of behavior and neural activity on a single scale.
Yes.
Is that a similar mode, or is that the mode that would be
Yes.
most predictive
So
of
at the
behavior?
time we did the multi-scale work, we hadn't yet developed the joint dynamical modeling framework. But absolutely. So the PSID framework, the DPAD framework, it's fundamentally about disentangling shared dynamics between two time series versus disjoint dynamics. So if you call these time series LFP and spike, you can do it with LFP. If you call it region A, region B, you can do inter-regional interactions. So at the time that we did it completely unsupervised. So it just happened that we found this shared dynamic. So in a way, it gives it a little bit more strength because we weren't looking for it, we just found it. But you can indeed use these disentangled representation tools such as DPAD and PSID to directly, intentionally look for shared dynamics if you want.